right, diving into a case today that I think is going to leave us all wondering, did the justice system actually get it right?
Mm,
Picture this 12-year-old boy in Uganda named Joseph Kasiri vanishes.
right.
Days later, his body's found, and the details are just absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
Decapitated, his genitals were missing.
Yes, this is a case from 2008, the Kato Kajubi case, and it just shook the nation. It really raised a lot of concerns about whether the justice system was really capable of, you know, delivering justice in such a brutal case.
Yeah, and it's such a head-scratcher because the prime suspect, a well-known businessman, Kato Kajubi, he was acquitted despite what seemed like pretty strong evidence.
Okay.
So we've got stacks of court documents, analyses, news reports, and we're trying to dig into all of it to figure out why that happened. We want to know, was justice truly served?
I think we really need to examine the legal process, the twists and turns in the case, look at how the evidence was evaluated. It's a fascinating case.
Definitely. Let's rewind back to the very beginning. What were the initial facts that the prosecution presented in this case?
Well, when Joseph Kasiri disappeared, the police zeroed in on two people, Katarega Umaru and his wife, Mariam Nabukira. They were neighbors of the victim's family. Both Katarega and Mariam claimed that Kajubi was involved in the disappearance.
So what did they say happened? What was their story?
They claimed that Kajubi had shown up at their house late one night with another man. They alleged that he offered the boy some soda and snacks that were drugged, and from there, well, things took a very dark turn. They eventually led police to the boy's body.
God, that's chilling. So based on that, how could Kajubi possibly end up walking free?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. In the initial trial, the judge, Justice Makibi, made a ruling of no case to answer.
Hold on, back up for a second. What does no case to answer even mean?
So it's a legal term that basically means that the prosecution's evidence is so weak that no reasonable court could convict the defendant based on what's been presented. Justice Mukibi decided that the prosecution just hadn't met that standard.
But their testimony, they described some pretty awful things. They said that Kajubi's associate, a man they called Stephen, actually committed the murder. They described the removal of the boy's body parts and even said there was this promised payment of 15 million shillings. How could that not be enough to at least make Kajubi defend himself?
That's where the complexities of accomplice testimony come into play. Remember, Katarega and Miriam were the first people the police focused on? They were suspects themselves.
So was the court thinking, well, they might be trying to shift the blame?
Exactly. The judge really scrutinized their statements and found inconsistencies that made him question how reliable their testimony was. For example, Miriam's initial statement to the police differed in some ways from what she said later in court.
Ah, so the judge might have thought, well, if her story keeps changing, maybe none of it is true. But what about other evidence? Weren't there phone records that linked Kajubi to the crime?
Yeah, phone records did show communication between Kajubi and Katarega, and they did place Kajubi near where the body was found on the night of the murder.
That seems pretty incriminating. And what about, I was reading about those blood stains.
Yes. The police did find a jerrycan and some clothes with blood stains at Katarega's house. The judge saw that as potentially pointing to Katarega's direct involvement in the killing.
So was the judge suggesting that maybe Katarega committed the murder and then tried to pin it on Kajubi?
That seems to be the narrative that he was building, but remember, this was just the initial trial. The prosecution wasn't about to let this go. They appealed the acquittal. And that's where things took a fascinating turn.
Okay, so the prosecution was basically saying, hang on a minute, we think the judge got this one wrong.
Right, and the Court of Appeal, a higher court, agreed with them. They decided that Justice Mukibi had made some mistakes in his assessment of the evidence and ordered a whole new trial, a retrial.
Wow, so a higher court basically stepped in and said, nope, we need to look at this again. What did they think the judge got wrong? Were they saying that Kajubi was definitely guilty?
Not quite. The Court of Appeal didn't declare Kajubi guilty. But they had some serious concerns about how the first trial was handled. For one thing, they felt that Justice Mukibi had jumped the gun by calling Katarega and Miriam accomplices without enough evidence to back that up. They also thought that he put too much weight on relatively minor inconsistencies in their statements and kind of dismissed them too easily.
So they were basically saying, hey, just because someone's story isn't perfect doesn't mean they're lying.
Exactly. And there was another big point. Kajubi had actually vanished for a whole month right after the murder. The prosecution argued that this was a sign of guilt. Who runs off for a month if they've got nothing to hide?
Yeah, that's a good point. But wouldn't Kajubi's lawyer have had some kind of explanation for that if he was innocent?
Well, because of the no case to answer ruling, Kajubi never had to present his defense at all. That's one of the reasons the retrial is so important. He would finally have to answer these questions and give his side of the story.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. This retrial sounds like it was a total game changer. Did it finally provide the answers everyone was looking for? Did Kajubi finally have to face the music?
That is a great question. And it's one we'll explore as our deep dive continues.
I can't wait. This is turning into a real legal thriller. We'll be back in a flash to dissect that retrial and all the new evidence that came to light. You won't want to miss it.
Yeah. So we left off with the Court of Appeal overturning Kajubi's acquittal and ordering that retrial.
Yeah, I was thinking about that during the break. They seemed pretty concerned that Katarega and Miriam were labeled as accomplices without enough proof. But how do you actually determine if someone's an accomplice? That seems kind of tricky.
Yeah, it really is a tricky area of the law. Legal experts debate this all the time. But in this case, the Court of Appeal made it clear that just because you're a suspect at first doesn't automatically make you an accomplice. To be considered an accomplice, there needs to be solid evidence that you were actively involved in the crime itself.
So you can't just be in the wrong place at the wrong time or even know about the crime. You got to have actually participated somehow.
That's the key point. And the Court of Appeal emphasized that there was no evidence that Katarega or Miriam physically took part in the murder itself. In fact, their testimony actually suggested that they were forced and threatened by Kajubi.
That makes sense. But even so, the judge in that first trial, he clearly wasn't buying their story. What exactly did he point to that made him think they weren't being truthful?
One of the big things Justice Mukibi focused on was what's called a charge and caution statement. So when Miriam was first arrested, she gave a statement to a magistrate. Now, this statement differed in some ways from what she said later when she testified in court.
Okay, but what exactly is a charge and caution statement?
It's a statement someone makes often to a magistrate when they've been arrested. In many countries, including Uganda, the police or other authorities are required to caution the suspect that they have the right to remain silent and that anything they say can be used against them in court. The statement is recorded and can be used as evidence.
Ah, okay. That clarifies things. So the judge saw those differences in Miriam's statements as a big red flag, like she was changing her story.
Yes, he interpreted it as a major contradiction that casts doubt on her overall credibility. However, the Court of Appeal disagreed. They argued that the judge should have taken into account the circumstances under which that first statement was given. Think about it. Miriam had just been arrested. She was likely under a lot of pressure.
So maybe her initial statement was influenced by fear or confusion or...
Exactly. The Court of Appeal felt that the judge shouldn't have used that initial statement to completely throw out everything else she said.
That's so interesting. It really shows how delicate this whole process of evaluating testimony can be. Are there any clear-cut rules that judges use to decide how much weight to give to what an accomplice says?
It would be great if there was some simple formula. Unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. Each case has its own unique complexities. But in general, judges are told to approach accomplice testimony with caution. They need to look for other evidence that comes from independent sources to back up what the accomplice is saying.
So you wouldn't want to send someone to jail just based on the word of someone who might have their own reasons to lie or change their story or...
That's exactly the idea. It's all about ensuring a just outcome. Carefully considering all the angles and the potential biases.
Now, bringing it back to the Kato Kajubi case, we talked earlier about those bloodstains that were found at Katarega's house. And it seemed like that was a big part of why the first judge didn't really believe his accusations.
Yeah, the bloodstained jerrycan and clothes were key pieces of evidence. But here's the really strange thing. That evidence was only mentioned by one single witness during cross-examination, a relative of the victim named Kasiri Paul. And he actually never said anything about them in his main testimony.
Wait a minute, so he just randomly brought that up later on? That seems really odd.
It does, doesn't it? And what makes it even more suspicious is that every other witness who had been at Katarega's house, including the police officers who searched the place, specifically said they didn't find anything incriminating there.
So it's basically his word against everyone else's.
Pretty much. And the Court of Appeal was very troubled by this whole situation. They questioned whether Paul's testimony was reliable and why the judge relied on it so heavily when he was building his version of what happened.
It sounds like there were quite a few loose ends and potentially overlooked details in that first trial.
There were, and don't forget, the prosecution also kept pointing to the fact that Kajubi disappeared for a whole month after the murder. They argued that this was a classic sign of guilt.
Yeah, that does seem pretty suspicious. Wouldn't Kajubi's lawyer have explained that away somehow if he was innocent?
Well, remember, because of that no case to answer ruling, Kajubi never actually had to present a defense in the first trial. That's why the retrial was so crucial. He was finally going to have to address all these issues and give his side of the story.
All right, so let's get to it. What happened at the retrial? Did it provide the answers that everyone was waiting for? Did justice finally prevail?
Well, the retrial was a dramatic turn of events. New evidence and arguments were presented, and the outcome was very different from the first trial.
Yeah, don't leave me hanging. What happened?
To put it simply, the retrial resulted in a conviction. Kajubi was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Wow. So in the end, even though it took a while, the justice system did work.
Yes, it did. But we can't ignore the fact that this case created a huge controversy in Uganda. Many people felt that the initial acquittal exposed some serious flaws in the legal system, especially in how it handles accomplice testimony, and how easily a judge can dismiss evidence.
Yeah, it definitely seems like this case had a big impact, raising questions about accountability and how complex these legal proceedings can be. So looking back on everything we've discussed, what are the key takeaways here? What can we learn from the Kato Kajubi case?
Well, this case underscores the importance of critically evaluating evidence and not jumping to conclusions based on preconceived notions or biases. Even seemingly damning evidence like those bloodstains needs to be carefully examined and corroborated.
Right, and when it comes to accomplice testimony, we have to remember that everyone, even those who may have been involved in a crime, deserves a fair trial. Their testimony can be valuable, but it needs to be carefully weighed against other evidence and potential motives. This whole case is a powerful reminder that justice isn't always a straight line. It requires diligence, a critical eye, and a dedication to seeking the truth, no matter how difficult it might be to uncover.
Well said. And it's worth mentioning that this case also brought to light the disturbing issue of ritualistic killings in Uganda, a topic that continues to spark discussion and concern.
It's a chilling reminder of the dark side of human belief and the devastating consequences it can have. You've given us a lot to think about.
It's been a fascinating journey through the twists and turns of this complex case. It really is amazing how this case, the Kato Kajubi case, just brings up so many important questions about justice and evidence and even cultural beliefs. Really makes you think.
It does, yeah. I mean, for you, what stands out as the most crucial takeaway from this whole case?
I think the biggest lesson here is just the absolute importance of critical thinking when it comes to evaluating evidence, especially in these complex cases like this one. It's so easy to just jump to conclusions based on, initial impressions or assumptions. But as we've seen, the truth can be way more nuanced than that.
Yeah, it's like there's two sides to every story, sometimes even more than that.
Yeah. Exactly. Take the blood-stained evidence, for example. On the surface, it seemed like a pretty clear indication of Katarega's guilt. But when you dig deeper and you consider all the conflicting accounts and the timing of when it was introduced and the lack of corroborating evidence, it raises some serious doubts. That's why it's so important to analyze everything, question every single detail, and consider, all the possible interpretations.
Yeah, and it's also so important, I think, for judges and juries to be impartial and to not let their own personal biases influence their decisions. It's about carefully weighing all the evidence, right, both for and against the accused.
Absolutely. And remember that principle of innocent until proven guilty is a cornerstone of any fair justice system. It means that the burden of proof lies with the prosecution to demonstrate guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The accused doesn't have to prove their innocence.
Right, and it's a fundamental principle that I think often gets overlooked in these high-profile cases. Everyone wants answers, everyone wants justice, but rushing to judgment without a thorough examination of the facts can lead to some serious miscarriages of justice.
Right. And the Kajubi case also underscores the crucial role of appeals courts. They act as a safeguard, ensuring that lower courts have applied the law correctly and that the rights of both the accused and the victims are protected.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the Court of Appeal, in this case, really scrutinized the initial judge's decisions, especially his handling of the accomplice testimony. It's a reminder that even judges can make mistakes, and having that system of checks and balances is essential.
And, it's also worth reflecting on the broader societal context of this case. The fact that ritualistic killings are still a concern in Uganda adds another layer of complexity to this whole discussion. It highlights the need to address those deep-seated beliefs and practices that can have such devastating consequences.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that justice isn't just about legal proceedings. It's about addressing the root causes of crime and violence. It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe and protected.
Well said. As we kind of wrap up our deep dive into the Kato Kajubi case, I think the most important message for our listeners is this. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop questioning. Whether it's a local crime or an international incident, it's our responsibility to be informed citizens, to, critically evaluate information, and to demand a just and equitable society for everyone.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself.
Hmm.
Thanks for guiding us through this intricate case. It's been a real eye-opener.
My pleasure. It's always a privilege to delve into these complex issues and to encourage critical thinking.
And to our listeners, if the Kato Kajubi case has piqued your interest, we encourage you to explore further. There are numerous articles, documentaries, and legal analyses available that delve even deeper into the specifics of this case and its wider implications. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.